Ruby was on her way to the bustling city, thrilled about the opportunities awaiting her during her week-long business trip. She had carefully chosen an Airbnb in a quaint neighborhood, hoping it would be a peaceful retreat after long days of meetings and networking. The charming cottage-style house was hosted by Henry, a polite and seemingly affable man in his early 40s, who had great reviews and a friendly demeanor. The first day went smoothly. Ruby attended her meetings and returned to the Airbnb, enjoying the comfort of the living room, which was lined with bookshelves and filled with the warm glow of the setting sun. She spent the evening reading, appreciating the tranquility of her temporary home. On the second night, Ruby noticed something odd. As she sat in the living room, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. She glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Dismissing it as fatigue from her busy day, she closed the blinds and tried to relax, but the feeling lingered, unsettling her. Trying to brush off her unease, Ruby went to bed early. She was just drifting off when she heard a distinct creaking noise, like a door slowly opening. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Gathering her courage, she got out of bed and walked quietly to the door, listening for any further sounds. Suddenly, she felt a draft, as if a window had been opened. Ruby quickly locked her bedroom door and called 911, whispering her fear to the operator. She barricaded the door with a chair and waited, every nerve on edge, until the police arrived. The officers conducted a thorough search of the house but found nothing unusual. They suggested that perhaps the noise had been the wind, or perhaps a door that hadn't been closed properly. Feeling embarrassed but not entirely reassured, Ruby thanked them and tried to convince herself that she was just being paranoid. The next morning, determined to shake off the previous night's fear, Ruby decided to explore the neighborhood before her meetings. As she walked through the tree-lined streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but the sidewalks were empty. That night, as she returned to the Airbnb, she couldn't shake her anxiety. She was unpacking her laptop when she noticed something strange about the bookshelf in the living room. It seemed slightly ajar, as if it had been moved. Her curiosity piqued. Ruby approached the shelf and ran her fingers along the edges, searching for anything unusual. To her surprise, she discovered a small latch hidden behind the books. With a click, the bookshelf swung open, revealing a narrow passageway that led into darkness. Her heart raced as she stepped inside the passage, a sense of dread creeping over her. She fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight, illuminating the narrow corridor. At the end was a heavy door, slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the room beyond. Inside, the room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls. In the center stood a wooden chair with worn leather straps attached to the arms, a table nearby holding an assortment of ominous items, a set of rusted tools, a video camera, and a knife with dried blood staining the blade. Ruby's stomach turned as she realized she had stumbled upon something horrific. On one wall, a series of monitors displayed live feeds from hidden cameras set up throughout the Airbnb. Her every move had been watched, recorded, and catalogued. Ruby's mind reeled with fear and disbelief as the pieces began to fit together. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her, a toilet flushing. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. The sound was coming from the basement. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but terror rooted her to the spot. As the bathroom door opened, Ruby saw him. Henry stepped into view, his expression shifting from surprise to a twisted smile that chilled her to the bone. "Ah, I see you found my little secret," he said, his voice low and menacing. Ruby's instincts took over, and she spun on her heel, sprinting back through the passageway. Her feet pounded against the floor as she raced for the stairs, fear lending her speed. She could hear Henry behind her, his footsteps echoing in pursuit. Reaching the stairs, Ruby stumbled and fell, pain shooting through her ankle. She scrambled to her feet, adrenaline driving her forward as Henry's shadow loomed closer. She burst into the living room, her eyes darting around for anything that could serve as a weapon or an escape route. Her gaze fell on a heavy lamp, and she grabbed it, swinging it with all her strength as Henry lunged at her. The lamp connected with his shoulder, causing him to stagger back, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Ruby ran for the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking with fear, and finally flung the door open. The cool night air hit her like a shock. Ruby fled into the night, her heart racing as she sprinted down the darkened street. Panic clawed at her as she glanced back, seeing Henry emerge from the house, his expression furious and determined. She pushed herself to run faster, her mind a whirlwind of terror and desperation. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of help. She saw a house with lights on and veered toward it, hoping to find refuge. She pounded on the door, her voice raw with fear as she begged for someone to open up. "Please, help me," she cried, her heart sinking when no one answered. She banged on the door again, but the house remained silent, and dread pooled in her stomach. Ruby turned and ran to the next house, pounding on the door with all her strength, tears streaming down her face. "Someone, please! He's after me!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Again, there was no response. The street seemed eerily deserted, the houses dark and unyielding. Her mind raced, the reality of her situation sinking in. She was alone, with nowhere to hide. The sound of Henry's footsteps echoed behind her, growing closer with each passing moment. Ruby's pulse thundered in her ears as she tore away from the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed a plan, something to throw Henry off her trail long enough for her to find safety. She darted into a narrow alleyway, her shoes pounding against the pavement as she ran deeper into the maze of side streets. The shadows closed around her, adding to her sense of being trapped. Her mind raced for options, adrenaline sharpening her focus. At the end of the alley, she spotted a chain-link fence. Her heart pounded with determination as she approached, knowing she had to keep moving. She climbed the fence, ignoring the sharp edges that bit into her palms, and dropped down on the other side. Ruby sprinted through a series of backyards, weaving between trees and parked cars, her mind a whirlwind of fear and strategy. She hoped to lose Henry in the labyrinth of suburban spaces, her instincts guiding her through the night. Behind her, she could hear Henry's pursuit, his voice a chilling reminder of the danger she faced. "You can't run forever, Ruby," he taunted, his voice echoing through the night. Ruby's pulse quickened, but she pushed herself onward, her body fueled by fear and adrenaline. She had to outsmart him, to find a way to escape and reach safety. Her thoughts raced as she scanned her surroundings, searching for anything that could help her turn the tide. She spotted a park up ahead, its entrance shrouded in darkness. With no better option, she darted inside, her feet pounding against the path as she wove through the trees. The branches cast eerie shadows, creating a disorienting maze that both terrified and concealed her. Breathing heavily, Ruby ducked behind a cluster of bushes, hoping to hide long enough to catch her breath and plan her next move. Her heart raced as she listened intently for any sign of Henry, her mind a jumble of fear and strategy. She heard his footsteps, slower now, as he stalked through the park, searching for her. Her breath caught in her throat as he passed dangerously close, his figure a dark silhouette against the night sky. She stayed perfectly still, willing herself to remain silent. Henry paused, scanning the area, and Ruby held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that any sound could give her away. She watched as he moved further into the park, giving her a momentary reprieve. Ruby's mind raced, searching for a plan. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to find a way to escape and alert the authorities. Her eyes scanned the area, landing on a path that led deeper into the park, toward a dense grove of trees. With a deep breath, she slipped from her hiding spot and crept toward the grove, her footsteps silent against the earth. Her heart pounded with fear and hope, her mind focused on the possibility of finding a way out. As she moved through the trees, she stumbled upon a small maintenance shed, its door slightly ajar. Ruby hesitated, her instincts screaming for her to keep moving, but desperation won out. She slipped inside, pulling the door closed behind her, and leaned against the wall, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The shed was dark and cramped, filled with gardening tools and old equipment. Ruby felt along the walls, her fingers brushing against a dusty workbench and a stack of tarps. She crouched in the corner, her mind racing as she considered her next move. The sound of footsteps approached, slow and methodical, sending a chill down Ruby's spine. Henry was close, too close. Her heart pounded in her ears as she pressed herself into the shadows, praying he wouldn't find her hiding spot. The footsteps stopped outside the shed, and Ruby's breath hitched in her throat. She could hear Henry's breathing, his presence a menacing force just beyond the door. Her mind raced with fear and desperation, knowing she was trapped. The door creaked open, and Henry stepped inside, his silhouette looming in the dim light. Ruby held her breath, her heart thundering in her chest as she fought to stay silent. She watched as he scanned the shed, his eyes searching the darkness. Her mind screamed for her to run, but she stayed frozen, willing herself to blend into the shadows. She felt her body tense, ready to fight or flee, her instincts screaming for survival. Henry moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the corners. Ruby's heart leapt into her throat as he paused, his gaze sweeping over her hiding spot. Her mind raced with panic, knowing that any moment could be her last. Suddenly, a noise outside the shed drew Henry's attention, a distant shout, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. His head snapped toward the door, his focus momentarily broken. Seizing the opportunity, Ruby bolted from her hiding spot, pushing past Henry with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. She sprinted out of the shed, her feet pounding against the ground as she ran toward the sound of safety. Behind her, she heard Henry curse, his footsteps pounding after her. Ruby pushed herself to run faster, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She couldn't let him catch her, not now, not when escape was within reach. As she burst from the grove of trees, Ruby spotted a group of people a late night gathering in the park. Her heart soared with hope as she sprinted toward them, her voice a desperate plea for help. "Please, help me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the night. The group turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to concern as they took in her disheveled appearance. Ruby reached them just as Henry emerged from the trees, his expression dark and menacing. But faced with a crowd, he hesitated, his bravado faltering as he realized he was outnumbered. Henry's eyes darted around, calculating his next move. Ruby watched, her heart pounding, as he slowly backed away, his gaze locked on her with a chilling promise of future reckoning. "Next time, Ruby," Henry sneered, before turning and disappearing into the shadows, leaving Ruby and the group standing in stunned silence. The group quickly gathered around Ruby, offering comfort and support as she explained what had happened. Someone called the police, and Ruby felt a wave of relief wash over her, knowing she was finally safe. As the police arrived and took her statement, Ruby realized that Henry was still out there, free to continue his sinister activities. The thought chilled her, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her life. Ruby's story didn't end with her escape from the park. Though the immediate danger had passed, the terror lingered, a shadow over her everyday life. She returned to her city, changed her routines, heightened her vigilance, and surrounded herself with supportive friends and family. Despite the fear that had gripped her, she was determined not to live in constant fear of Henry's return. A few weeks later, just as Ruby began to find a semblance of normalcy, a message notification popped up on her phone. It was from Instagram, a new message request. Hesitant but curious, she opened it, only to find a message from an account she didn't recognize. Her blood ran cold as she read the message. "Hey, Ruby, you were clever that night. I had so many plans for us. But don't worry, I'm not finished with you yet. I'll be watching, waiting for the perfect moment when you're least expecting it. I'll hunt you down when you're unaware, and you'll see that escaping me once doesn't mean you're safe forever. Henry." A chill swept over her as she absorbed the implications. Henry was out there, watching her every move, biding his time. The sinister promise echoed in her mind, reinforcing her resolve to stay alert and vigilant. Despite the fear the message instilled, Ruby refused to let it break her. She immediately contacted the authorities, providing them with the message and any information that could help track Henry down. Ruby knew she was in a nightmare that wouldn't end, and the message from Henry served as a terrifying reminder of the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of her life. She refused to be paralyzed by fear, channeling her anxiety into action. Determined to protect herself, she installed state-of-the-art security systems in her home, including cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced locks. Her friends and family rallied around her, forming a tight-knit support network that she could rely on for safety and solace. Despite her precautions, sleep was elusive. Each creak of her house, each rustle of leaves outside her window, sent her heart racing. She took self-defense classes and carried a whistle and pepper spray wherever she went. Her senses were heightened, constantly on alert for any sign of Henry. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a tense rhythm. Ruby's vigilance never waned, but she gradually allowed herself to enjoy moments of normalcy until one night, when everything changed again. She was returning home from a late dinner with friends, her nerves slightly eased by the evening's laughter and camaraderie. As she approached her house, she noticed something odd, a faint glow from a window on the second floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't left any lights on. Ruby paused, her mind racing. The logical part of her tried to explain it away, a reflection, perhaps, or a trick of the light. But the instinctive fear that had kept her alive screamed that something was wrong. She slipped her phone from her pocket and quietly dialed 911, whispering her address and situation to the operator as she edged closer to the house. Her fingers trembled as she hung up, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Moving silently, Ruby crept toward the back of the house, avoiding the front door and any potential traps Henry might have set. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached a side window, peering inside. The living room was empty, but the unsettling glow persisted, emanating from the hallway leading to the stairs. She strained to see the source, her imagination conjuring images of what or who might be waiting. The operator's voice on her phone reassured her that officers were en route, but Ruby felt the urgency of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't wait. She had to know what was happening inside her home. Taking a deep breath, Ruby steeled herself and opened the window, slipping inside as quietly as she could. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet as she made her way through the darkened rooms, her heart a steady drumbeat of fear. The glow was more pronounced now, spilling from the top of the stairs like a spectral presence. Ruby moved cautiously, inching her way up, each step a nerve-wracking journey into the unknown. As she reached the landing, she saw the source of television, set to a static-filled channel, casting an eerie light across the hallway. The door to her bedroom stood ajar, and Ruby's skin prickled with dread as she approached. Inside, her worst fears materialized. The room was in disarray, the bed covers thrown aside, drawers pulled open and contents strewn across the floor. And on the wall, scrawled in red paint, was a chilling message. "I told you I'd be back." Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her mind racing. Henry had been here, inside her sanctuary, violating the one place she thought she could be safe. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind her, and Ruby spun around, eyes wide with terror. Henry emerged from the shadows, his face twisted into a malevolent grin. "Surprise," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. Ruby's instincts kicked in, and she bolted down the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground. She sprinted for the stairs, Henry's footsteps pounding behind her, a relentless echo of danger. As she reached the bottom, the front door burst open, and uniformed officers flooded the house, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. Ruby stumbled into their arms, her breath coming in ragged gasps as relief and fear collided in a dizzying rush. Henry skidded to a halt, his eyes darting wildly as he assessed the situation. He was trapped, his plan unraveling around him. "Hands in the air," one of the officers shouted, training his weapon on Henry. The man's grin faltered, replaced by a snarl of rage and desperation. In a sudden, frenzied movement, Henry lunged toward Ruby, a knife glinting in his hand. The officers responded instantly, tackling him to the ground, the weapon skittering across the floor as they subdued him. Ruby watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as they handcuffed Henry and led him away. His eyes locked onto hers, a promise of retribution simmering beneath his defeated glare. "Next time," he hissed as they dragged him out the door, his voice dripping with malice. Ruby stood in the wreckage of her home, trembling with relief and lingering terror. She knew that, despite Henry's capture, the scars of his threat would take time to heal. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that the nightmare was finally over. The officers stayed with her, ensuring her safety and helping her piece together the events of the night. As the adrenaline faded, Ruby found comfort in their presence, a tangible reminder that she was not alone. In the days that followed, she began the slow process of rebuilding her life, reclaiming her home and her sense of security. She remained vigilant, but the shadow of fear gradually lifted, replaced by a renewed determination to live fully and freely. Ruby knew that she could never erase the memory of Henry's threat, but she was determined to move forward, stronger and more resilient than ever before. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, her spirit unbroken and her future bright. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of terror and suspense, don't forget to subscribe to Vulnerable Screams for more disturbing stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for joining us in this dark journey into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and have a frightful good night.